there.
Sorry
And
about that.
I'm just
Mhm.
anxious to hear this report from Paul Walsh, but I just need to maintain the point that I am looking desperately for speakers because we want to have at least one 6 months. Well, sometimes we can't, but nevertheless, I keep trying. All right, for everyone should know, Paul got asked to speak about the topic. He's a scholar on this area, and he's also a scholar on the role of the Italian army in World War I on the Western Front. Remember, they were after Caporetto. The Italians volunteered an army to fight on the French side during that war. But this first one I asked him to speak about was one that most people don't know anything about, which you see before you, the Belgian armory expedition on the Russian front. Now, Paul is a scholar in this field, and I'd like to know more about what he did and why his interest is in this area. So let me turn this over to him, let him introduce himself, and then let him hear his program. Rather, one thing, he rather deliver the entire program before you have questions and answers. So at the end, hold your questions and then ask me on for an explanation. All right, Paul, it's your show.
Thank you very much. A little biography. I've had a lifelong fascination with military history. I earned a master's in diplomatic and military history from Temple University. My interest can be described as eclectic. Uh, I particularly like the paths not taken in terms of history and military history. Not that I don't like the mainstream either. Uh, I think part of the reason I was interested in this was because it was such an obscure subject, and secondly, I'm also interested in mechanized warfare. And of course, this is an example of that from the First World War. So I guess we'll get started, and I'll read from my script here. Among the all but forgotten chapters of World War I is the deployment of Western European armored detachments to fight on the Eastern Front. From France came the 10th, and by the way, please excuse my pronunciation of either French or Russian words. That's not my forte. So, from France came the 10th Group des Autocannons Automatrices, that was intended to aid the Romanians. Unfortunately, the unit lost most of its Renault armored cars in a fire shortly after its arrival at Archangel. Great Britain contributed the Royal Naval Air Service's Armored Car Expeditionary Force, commanded by Oliver Locker Lampson. The ACEF operated in the Caucasus in 1916 and in Galicia the following year. But the most unlikely of these detachments was the Corps Expeditionnaire des Autocannons Maîtrisés Belge and Russia, or ACM for short. Here we are. There we go. The ACM's origins can be traced back to the first month of the war, when German forces flooded across the border into Belgium. The Belgians employed civilian touring cars in lightning raids against parties of Uhlans and advancing enemy columns. The motor enthusiast Lieutenant Charles Henkart had his two automobiles partially armored and led them in daring operations until his death in early September, when he was cornered by no less than 450 enemy cavalry. Hankart's exploits attracted considerable attention, inspiring the Belgian General Staff to organize an official corps of autocannons Maîtrisés equipped with purpose-built armored cars. By then, the enemy was well on their way to overrunning all of Belgium. King Albert I ordered the dikes just north of the river Yser to be breached, flooding most of the land in front of the advancing Germans. The enemy was forced to halt, but the flooded landscape and the subsequent appearance of increasingly elaborate systems of trenches denied the ACM a role on the Western Front. Initially, the ACM was attached to the Belgium's 1st Cavalry Division, but in November of 1914, it was decided to reorganize the formation as an independent unit. Some 350 volunteers were placed under the command of Major Auguste Collin and began a regime of training in the vicinity of Paris. Among the skills they had to master was the use of new vehicles, the Moors and Peugeot armored cars, so called for the chassis upon which they were built. They both sported open-top superstructures with an average of 5 millimeters of armored protection. The Moors had a crew of 4, was powered by a 35 horsepower Minerva engine that gave it a top speed of 37 miles per hour and was armed with a pedestal-mounted 8 millimeter Hotchkiss machine gun. The marginally slower Peugeot, with a top speed of 31 miles per hour, was armed with a pedestal-mounted 37 millimeter Hotchkiss cannon. The ACM's armored elements consisted of 2 batteries, with each battery containing an armored command car, 2 Moors, and 3 Peugeots. For reconnaissance, liaison, and support in the form of dismounted infantry, there were 2 motorcycle sections and a bicycle platoon. Supply was provided by 2 officers and 65 enlisted men, manning 4 trucks. Medical personnel equipped with an ambulance and a catering section rounded out the unit. In a ceremony at Longchamps on the 17th of April, 1915, the French Chief of Staff to the military governor of Paris, General Jean-Baptiste Clégier, officially presented the ACM flag to Major Collin. The components of the ACM paraded before General Clégier and various Belgian and French dignitaries, striking a dashing appearance in their unique leather uniforms designed by the famous Parisian courtier Jean Paquin. On the 21st of April, 1915, with their training completed, the ACM was billeted in a number of large farms located near the Franco-Belgian border. It was envisioned that they could either be used in a future Allied offensive or, conversely, as a means of counterattacking an enemy breakthrough. The inaction following their vigorous training and the excitement of graduation can only have felt anticlimactic. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Theater, the Imperial Russian Army had organized its first units of armored cars, units whose successful employment received considerable coverage in French newspapers. It's not surprising, then, that the idle existence of the ACM came to the attention of the Russian military attaché to Belgium, Colonel Andrei Prebiano. Strange name for a Russian. He concluded that these Belgian armored cars could be put to better use on the Eastern Front. Colonel Prebiano raised the issue with King Albert I and shortly afterwards met with the Belgian General Staff, who informed him that Albert I wished to aid the Tsar against their common enemy in whatever manner possible. Colonel Prebiano immediately contacted his counterpart in Paris, Count Alexei Ignatieff, and together they telegraphed Petrograd to inform the government of King Albert I's offer. Protocol, however, dictated that Tsar Nicholas II had to make a formal request of King Albert I before the latter could make his offer officially. It was not until the 10th of August, 1915, that Albert I made his official offer of the ACM to Tsar Nicholas I. There were, however, at least 2 problems with sending a Belgian army unit to serve in Russia. First, Belgium and Imperial Russia were co-belligerents. They both happened to be at war with Germany, but they were not joined in a treaty of alliance. Second, Belgian law disallowed members of the armed forces from serving outside of Belgium. The Force Publique that policed the Belgian Congo, for instance, was separate from the Belgian army. To circumvent these obstacles, officers and enlisted men had to voluntarily agree to serve in the ACM in Russia and nominally become members of the Imperial Russian Army, nominally. This inadvertently increased the unit's esprit de corps. The men of the ACM already viewed themselves as something of an elite, manning their innovative Jules Verne weapons that set them apart from ordinary foot soldiers. Chosen for a mission in far-off exotic land, out of sight of the Belgian High Command, they maintained a cavalier spirit that was in distinct contrast to the grim routine of trench warfare on the Western Front. Small wonder that the soldiers of the ACM earned a reputation for rowdiness and found a kindred spirit among the Cossacks, rather than the fatalistic peasants who made up the bulk of the Tsar's army. The ACM contained a number of notable individuals in its ranks. Julian Lahaut was a trade union activist who, influenced by his experiences in Russia, went on to become the head of the Communist Party in Belgium. A leader in the resistance during World War II, he survived captivity only to be assassinated on his doorstep after the war. The Thierry brothers from Liège, Oscar and Marcel, wrote about their experiences in the ACM, Marcel becoming a celebrated poet. Henry Hurd, or I should say Henri Hurd, better known by his stage name Constant Lebrun, was already a famous wrestler when he joined the ACM, having won the World Championship 4 times. The ACM appears to have been reorganized for its mission in Russia. Major Kalan remained in command, but the number of armored batteries was increased from 2 to 4. Each battery was supposed to contain 3 Moors and 2 Peugeots, giving the ACM a total of 20 armored cars. However, different accounts give the total number of armored cars as between 12 and 13. The pool of auxiliary vehicles was substantially increased from 4 to 23. Officially, the newly organized ACM contained 12 officers and 359 enlisted men, but the total number of men who left for Russia are listed in some sources as 333. On the 21st of September 1915, the ACM departed the port of Brest aboard the British cargo ship SS Ray Castle. Their voyage through the North Sea was rough at times, but largely uneventful. On the 6th of December 1915, I'm sorry, I skipped one here. They disembarked in Archangel on the 13th of October, where they were met by an enthusiastic crowd accompanied by music and singing. Within a few days, the ACM had settled into the Imperial Guards barrack at Peterhof, some 12 miles west of Petrograd. Upon learning of their arrival, Tsar Nicholas II sent his thanks to King Albert I on the 19th of October. Quote, "All Russians will receive their Belgian brother-in-arms with enthusiasm," unquote. Upon learning, but when the Tsar's cable was released to the public, it was the first that the people of Belgium heard of the ACM, and the reaction was not positive. With only a small portion of the nation free from German occupation, the Belgians felt that every effort should be directed at liberating their homeland. Of course, any objections at this point were futile. On the 6th of December 1915, the Tsar himself inspected the men and machines of the ACM at the royal family's summer residence of Tsarskoe Selo, 15 miles south of Petrograd. It seemed that everything was now settled, but unfortunately this wasn't the case. The Belgian military attaché in Russia, General Baron de Renkel, raised objections to Major Kalan's command. It seems that the standard pay of the officers and men of the ACM was supplemented through the efforts of a wealthy Belgian ambassador. General Reichel brought this to the attention of Prime Minister Charles de Broqueville, who in turn sent telegrams to both the foreign minister, Napoleon Eugene Bayens, and the ambassador in Petrograd, indicating his wish to see Major Kalin replaced. However, when Major Kalin inquired with the Russian General Staff concerning his dismissal, they unofficially indicated that the reason was that they had objected to the Major's employment of a Jew among the 33 Russians who were officially attached to the ACM. Whatever the actual reason, it can hardly be a coincidence that Major Kalin's replacement, who took up his post in early April of 1916, was Major Hippolyte Semet, who before the war had served as the adjutant to General Reichel himself. The general appears to have shown some of his true colors by leaving his comfortable abode in Petrograd only once to visit the ACM at the front. Beginning on the 10th of January 1916, the ACM departed for the Galician front, where they were attached to the 11th Army under the command of General Vladimir Viktorovich Sakharov. Major Semet established a depot with a workshop and a hospital at Kiev, while his men were billeted at the village of Zabarez for the winter. When summer arrived, the Belgians would have the good fortune to participate in the Imperial Army's most successful offensive of the war, named after its author, General Alexei Alexeyevich Brusilov. By the end of spring, the officers of the ACM were conducting personal reconnaissance of the locations where they intended to operate, resulting in the unit suffering its first casualty. On the 31st of May, the commander of Battery 2, Captain Paul Rose, was assessing the ground leading to the village of Ivankivtsi on the left bank of the river Seret, when shrapnel from an enemy shell struck him in the face. Captain Rose lost his right eye, putting him out of action for months. Consistent with Russian Army practices, the armored batteries of the ACM were attached to specific divisions, namely the 4th and 16th Infantry Divisions of the 6th Corps. Each battery, ideally composed of 37 millimeter cannon, armed Peugeots, and 2 Morse equipment with machine guns, was accompanied by its own contingent of troops on motorcycles and bicycles. One source states that there were a total of 13 Belgian armored cars used to support the Russian soldiers of the 6th Corps. That the ACM may have been short of its full paper contingent of 20 armored cars is also suggested by Major Semet's decision to assign Battery 3 the task of evacuating wounded to Kiev. The role of the 6th Corps in the Brusilov offensive was to cross the river Seret and advance westward with a focus on the dual road and rail lines leading from Ternopil to the strategic town of Lviv. At 1100 hours on the 4th of June, following a brief but intensive barrage, the 6th Corps launched their assaults across the river Seret. As they suffered heavy losses against the men of the 32nd Austro-Hungarian Division, they were supported by fire from the armored cars of Battery 2, now commanded by Felix Oden. Oden's men peppered enemy positions while coming under enemy artillery fire. At substantial cost, the Russian infantry managed to capture the enemy's front-line trenches.
I'm on a Zoom program. Call me in and out.
Following nightfall, Oden was ordered to withdraw to a village located near Ternopil. To the difficulties of traveling along an unfamiliar route in darkness was added a downpour that transformed the dirt roads into muddy streams. During the trek, one armored car slipped into a shell crater, while 2 others sank in the mud, suffering damage as their crews sought to extricate them. It was only through the assistance of teams of Russian artillery horses that Battery 2 finally managed to reach its destination by dawn. The ACM was now employed in supporting Russian efforts to capture the pair of villages on the north side of the Ternopil-Lviv road, Virabivka and Sabriv. On the 9th of June, the 6th Corps resumed its operations, resulting in 11 hours of fighting for Hill 389, which overlooked Vorabrivka from the north. The Belgians provided assistance to the Russian troops, who launched no less than 7 successive assaults on the high ground, leaving them in control of only a portion of Hill 389 by the end of the day. Nevertheless, the ACM's contribution was mentioned in a Russian dispatch of the 10th of June. Quote, Belgian armored automobiles gave our troops powerful support in fighting, which took place near Hilidaki and Sebrau. Unquote. The Austro-Hungarian commander in charge of Vorobivka must have lost his nerve during the fighting for Hill 389, as the majority of the defenders appear to have evacuated the village, leaving behind only a few machine gun nests. Nevertheless, as the 5 armored cars of Battery 1 accompanied the Russian troops advancing on Vorobivka, they came under heavy fire, resulting in the ACM's first fatality. When the gun crew of the vehicle commanded by Maurice von Esch were wounded by a shell burst, Maurice Tang provided cover fire with his armored car, while another under Harold Emmerlink escorted von Esch's vehicle to safety. Unfortunately, they hadn't gotten very far when Emmerlink's armored car stalled, its rear wheels rolling backwards into a shell crater. Private Jacques Becker, the 22-year-old son of Senator Baron de Becker-Remy, attempted to secure a tow cable between the Emmerlink and Van Esch's cars, but he was fatally struck by a bullet in the forehead. 2 days later, his funeral was held in Ternopil, presided over by the ACM chaplain, Pierre Lenz. A Belgian honor guard and a military band accompanied the hearse to the cemetery, where the burial was attended by many Russian officers and townspeople. Fighting continued on and off on the Galician front, but the 6th Corps' next major effort came in August. Attacking along an 18-mile wide front, the 4th Division in the north was to advance along the familiar Ternopil-Lviv route, and the 16th Division in the center was to move towards the village of Konyiki, while the 23rd Division in the south was to drive towards the town of Berezeny. The offensive began on the 10th of August with the ACM supporting units of the 4th Division. Accompanying squadrons of Don Cossacks, a detachment of 10 ACM cyclists under Brigadier Georges Mathot reconnoitered the approach to the settlement at dawn, reporting that the way to Vorobivka was clear. Felix Oden led Battery 2 forward into the village, where it was discovered that the Austro-Hungarians had beat a hasty retreat, leaving behind weapons, uniforms, food, and drink. But any advance towards Sabriv for Battery 2 was forestalled by obstructions erected by the enemy. The Belgians attempted to clear the way with pick and shovel, but artillery fire forced the armored cars to fall back. However, this didn't prevent the cyclists from pressing onward. On Friday, the 11th of August, platoon commander Louis de Grip led his men into the midst of the village of Sabriv, which was found to be in ruins. De Grep discovered that the only location still in enemy hands was a single building along the Ternopil-Lviv railway. He deployed his men in preparation to launch an assault, but Austro-Hungarian reinforcements arrived unexpectedly. Not to be deterred, de Grip rushed forward with his men, only to be cut down by a mortal wound. The attack failed, and the enemy artillery cost the Belgians 3 more lives, so that the survivors of the cyclist detachment withdrew from Sabriv. The following day, the armored cars of Battery 1, commanded by Lieutenant Edgard von der Donk, drove west along the Ternopil-Lviv road towards the village of Ozerna. After repairing a bridge, they reached Ozerna, where they came under fire from an armored train covering the enemy's withdrawal. Battery 1 ended up pinned down in the Jewish cemetery by Austro-Hungarian fire. They were eventually joined by a Russian infantry regiment. Together, under a clear moonlit sky, the Belgians and Russians drove the Austro-Hungarian troops back across the river Strippa, securing the village. Lieutenant van der Donk claimed that had he been supported by more infantry and sappers, his detachment could have pressed their pursuit far beyond Ozerna. Battery 2 caught up with the Austro-Hungarian armored train on a sideline at a station just north of Ozerna. Felix Oden's 5 armored cars traded shots with the armored train, but the Belgians were not about to forego an early lunch due to enemy fire. Oscar Thierry related how he and his brother Marcel were returning on bicycle with 2 bottles of Hungarian wine for the crew of the armored car Shoshat, commanded by Bonini Volkert. When they came under fire, quote, "We threw ourselves on the bottles as if they were treasures," unquote. Thus refreshed, Felix Oden called for volunteers to deal with the armored train. Among those who answered the call were Sergeant Leon Luciel and the redoubtable Constant Lemarin. Using whatever cover they could find, the men reached the sideline and attached explosives to the rails. Although a sudden downpour temporarily interfered with their efforts to light the fuse, the task was ultimately accomplished. The enemy train responded to the explosion with machine gun fire, but the demolition party returned safely. Both Sergeant Lossel and Constant Lemarin were mentioned in dispatches for their bravery. They, in turn, applied the name Ozerna to the sides of their respective armored cars. In the aftermath of their actions with the armored train, the men of Battery 2 set about exploring the railway station. To their utter amazement, they discovered a large wooden bench marked Depot Scheerbeek, Scheerbeek being one of the 19 municipalities of Brussels. How it had ended up in a railway station of an obscure village in Galicia was anybody's guess. The respite for Felix Oden's men, however, was brief. 4 armored cars of Battery 2 now set out for the town of Zaborov, 9 miles west of Ozerna. A pontoon bridge erected by the Russians enabled the Belgians to cross the river Strippa and support their allies as they fought their way into the center of the town. There, the Russians discovered a well-stocked cellar, the contents of which they shared with the Belgians. Oscar Thierry noted, quote, "No Grand Cru, a regional vintage, has ever done me more good than that first sip of German wine," unquote. At this point, no further advances were attempted by the Russians, though fighting continued with the enemy troops entrenched in the heights of Przywitsy, which overlooked Zaborov. The town's inhabitants fled the all too frequent artillery and machine gun fire, which set alight the straw roofs of the houses in the Jewish quarter. The men of the ACM, of course, had no choice but to remain and settled into their new home. Typically, they were able to make the best of their situation. Despite bullets and explosions, the Belgians enjoyed more than one celebratory feast in the abandoned residence of Zaborov's mayor, including a 20th birthday party for the driver of the armored car Shoshat, Jose Wegmans. Illuminated by candlelight, they enjoyed chicken, duck, coffee, and wine. But of course, the war had not gone away. One bright summer morning, Battery 2 was ordered to attack an enemy position around Przywitsy. During the fighting, a bullet hit Sergeant Leon Lossel in his chest, leaving him seriously wounded. Oscar Thierry responded with fire at the enemy that was fueled by rage. Quote, "I never thought that one could experience so much joy to destroy, to burn, to obliterate," unquote. On the 1st of September, the cyclist Desiree Gomez had his left foot torn off by an exploding shell and was evacuated to the ACM's hospital in Kiev. The shelling was the prelude to an Austro-Hungarian attempt to retake Zaborov. Later that afternoon, Russian infantry dug in around the railway station on the outskirts of the town, were subjected to a heavy barrage followed by waves of enemy troops. Felix Oden personally led 3 armored cars in a race to the threatened sector. They sped past the Russian outposts and, to the cheers of their hard-pressed allies, mowed down the enemy troops who were caught in the open. Belgian machine gun fire kept the surviving Austro-Hungarian soldiers pinned down, enabling the Russians to systematically eliminate each detachment. As the sun began to set, Russian reinforcements entered the line, enabling Felix Oden and his men to return to the center of Zaborov. In the words of Oscar Thierry, quote, "Intoxicated by the smoke and drunken emotion and happiness, we screamed like crazy, but we heard nothing because our eardrums are still numb from the shooting. At the church in Zaborov, we jumped out of the armored cars. There are waiting to hear our heroes, our comrades are waiting to hear the heroic stories," unquote. As the weather grew colder, snow and ice severely limited the use of armored cars, so that the ACM went into winter quarters. The unit's combat vehicles and support elements were withdrawn to Ternopil, while the crews were billeted in Ozerna. There, the Jewish synagogue was used as a hospital. Dr. Valery Bressin, when not busy treating frostbite cases, jotted entries into his journal. Quote, in his 17 November entry, quote, "We have the impression that everyone has forgotten about us," unquote. Far from their families and homes, enduring the cold, dark nights in a foreign land, such thoughts would have come naturally to all the men of the ACM. But in fact, they had not been forgotten. Belgians living in Moscow organized the donation of musical instruments to servicemen in Ozerna, so that an ad hoc orchestra was raised that performed in the canteen on Sundays. Furthermore, in Berlin, there were newspaper articles about the presence of the ACM on the Russian front, assuring readers that it had lost 3 armored cars in combat, that Major Semet had been wounded, and that there were no less than 36 Belgians buried in the Ternopil cemetery. Allied propaganda proved just as faulty, claiming in Petit Journal de Paris that the ACM had conducted a raid 370 miles behind enemy lines. Stories such as these persuaded some 100 Belgians to volunteer for service with the unit. The new recruits arrived in Ozerna around the 1st of January 1917. The ACM also received occasional official visits. On the 12th of June 1917, the Belgian minister, Emile van der Velde, while on a mission to Russia, paid a call on the men at Ozerna. Undoubtedly, Minister van der Velde's mission was associated with the Allies' effort to ensure that Russia's new leader, Alexander Kerensky, remained committed to the war. Back in March, Tsar Nicholas II had been forced to abdicate in favor of the democratic government that had seized control in Petrograd. But the opposition to the Tsar was generated primarily by opposition to the war, placing Kerensky's government, which depended on financial and material support from Britain and France, between a rock and a hard place. Against his better judgment, Kerensky was persuaded to launch a major offensive. I think I skipped one. Yes, I skipped one. There you go. Because of the growing unreliability of Russian troops, greater reliance was now placed on non-Russian units, including both the ACM and the British Armored Car Expeditionary Force, which had been transferred from the Caucasus to Galicia. The ACM was assigned to support the 2nd Finnish Rifle Division of the 6th Corps. Together, the divisions of the 6th Corps, 6th and 49th Corps were to conduct a pincer operation designed to capture the village of Konyuki. Located south of the Ternopil-Lviv road, Konyuki lay in the fault line between the 9th Corps of the Austro-Hungarian Second Army and the 25th Corps of the Austro-German Sud Army, presenting the Russian 11th Army with a potentially weak seam in the enemy's lines. The area around Konyuki was held by the Austro-Hungarian 19th and 54th Divisions, with the German 223rd Division held in reserve. Following 2 days of bombardment along a 40-mile front, the Kerensky offensive began at 0900 hours on the 1st of July. The Sixth Corps, acting as the northern arm of the pincer, smashed through the defenses of the Austro-Hungarian 54th Division, forcing the enemy to rush forward elements of the 223rd Division in an effort to seal the breach. Battery 4, under command of Captain Walter Brideau, would have provided support for the Finns of the 2nd Rifle Division, but for the intervention of the weather. It had been raining throughout the days leading up to the offensive. Captain Brideau ordered his accompanying cyclists to improve the roadway so that the armored cars wouldn't sink to their axles. As the road crew made their way forward through the previously contested ground, they had to move hundreds of bodies, a testament to the ferocity of the fighting. They also encountered thousands of dejected Austro-Hungarian prisoners moving in the opposite direction. With its band playing and colors flying, an entire regiment composed of Czechs, escorted by Cossacks, paraded through Ternopil. Captain Brideau took this opportunity to collect some intelligence. After various POWs had been interrogated, they were relieved of their insignia, which the Belgians kept as souvenirs. Before sunrise the following day, Battery 4 set out to catch up with the Finns. Passing Russian corpses along the road, the 4 armored cars and 20 cyclists wound their way down the bare south slope of the valley into which Konyuki was nestled. To the Belgian surprise, the village appeared deserted. They later learned that the Russians had withdrawn the previous night. However, when crewmen sought to pick some apples from an orchard behind one of the houses, they discovered the presence of enemy troops. Captain Brideau remained confident. His forces, after all, were in possession of Konyuki. He allowed his men to forage for breakfast, slaughtering a cow and some chickens. But the peace was shattered shortly after noon, when a hostile spotter circling above began directing an artillery barrage down upon the village. Captain Brideau ordered his crewmen to open fire with their machine guns, but the enemy aircraft continued undeterred. Without warning, the armored car under the command of Jean Gossin was hit. As flames spouted from his vehicle, Gossin stumbled towards the bank of the river that ran through the village. Then a terrific explosion erupted between Gossin and Oscar Thierry's armored cars. A piece of shrapnel tore through René Roussal's helmet, killing him instantly. Another crewman, Louis Lechart, was decapitated. By contrast, Benoni Valcart was left unscathed, but the 9 remaining crewmen were all hit, including Oscar Thierry, whose wounds were so serious that he wasn't expected to survive. Initially, Captain Brideau was determined to stay, but Gossin and Valcart convinced him of the need to withdraw. Having removed anything still usable, including its armament, Gossin's armored car was left behind. Under enemy fire, Battery 4 then retraced its steps up the hillside road that was bereft of cover. As a footnote to the unit's first action in Konyuki, a veteran of the ACM, Jean Trosters, recounted a conversation he had after the war with a fellow passenger on a train to Lisbon. Emil Podbiri was a Czech who happened to have served as an artillery officer in the Austro-Hungarian army. Podbiri related to Trooster how, on one occasion, his battery had been firing on enemy troops occupying a village named Konyuki. Observing through his binoculars where his shells were falling, he noted a direct hit on a group of armored cars. Satisfied that he had accomplished his mission, Podbiri ordered his battery to cease fire. The ACM, however, wasn't finished with Konyuki. Later that same day, Russian troops were sent to reoccupy the village, and Battery 2 was assigned to provide them with support. When the Belgians arrived, the Russian infantry were seeking to advance across the clearing in the forest behind Koniki. On the opposite edge of the clearing were two enemy bunkers shielded by barbed wire. A pair of combat vehicles set about silencing the enemy positions, but they proved tougher than expected. One of the armored cars ran out of ammunition and then became immobilized by a shell crater. It was eventually pulled free by Belgians and Russians using cables. Constant Lemoran commanded the second vehicle, which happened to be a Russian model that had been substituted for one of the Belgian armored cars. He now lost patience and ordered his driver, Auguste Godefroy, to smash through the barbed wire so that they could engage the bunker at close quarters. Tragically, this cost Godefroy his life, as enemy machine gun bullets succeeded in penetrating the vehicle's armor, inflicting a mortal wound. Constant Lemoran himself received no less than 5 bullets, one in his back, 2 in one of his legs, 1 in his shoulder, and 1 in his arm. The third crewman, Eugene Vallee, braved enemy fire to run back to the Russian positions for help. Meanwhile, Constant Lemoran, having fallen out of the vehicle's side door, crawled to the relative safety of some undergrowth, where he was rescued by five of his Belgian comrades. Vallee, who insisted on going back for Godefroy, had to be physically restrained. The second engagement in Koniki would prove to be the last significant experience of combat for the ACM. While the morale of the assault troops that were used to spearhead the Kerensky offensive was generally high, the divisions that were scheduled to follow up the lead units were almost entirely unreliable. When ordered to advance, they refused. As such, despite initial gains, Kerensky's offensive ended only a few days after it had begun. On the 19th of July, reinforced by between 8 and 9 German divisions transferred from the Western Front, the Central Powers launched a counteroffensive in Galicia. Through ground that had been purchased so dearly over the years, both the ACM and the Russians were forced to retreat back to Ternopil. Seeking to make a stand along the River Surete, the Belgians were ordered to support the 22nd Corps. But amidst chaotic scenes of panic and looting, Ternopil was abandoned, allowing the Germans to cross the River Surete and occupy the town on the 26th of July without firing a shot, an operation, incidentally, that Kaiser Wilhelm II was present to witness. The enemy advance finally ground to a halt along the pre-war Austro-Russian border. In contrast to the front, where activity died down, events were transpiring in Petrograd, where confidence in Kerensky's government was swiftly evaporating. In November, the Bolsheviks seized power. Because the Bolsheviks had declared their intention of making a separate peace, the Belgian government responded to these developments by ordering the ACM to return home. Little did anyone realize at the time how difficult it would be to carry out such an order. On the 25th of December, a train composed of 50 rail cars transported the ACM to Kyiv, where the unit was quartered in the Sviatoshin barracks, with some of its personnel billeted in St. Michael's Monastery. In the first months of 1918, the city was in the eye of the storm as civil war erupted throughout Russia. On the 22nd of January, the government in the Ukraine broke with the Bolshevik national government in Petrograd, and 7 days later, Bolsheviks in Kyiv staged an uprising that resulted in 6 days of fighting. On the 9th of February, Red Army forces commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Mikhail Moryavov arrived in Kyiv. The Belgians witnessed all these events and did their best to remain above the fray. The Bolsheviks, not surprisingly, viewed them with great suspicion and repeatedly interfered with their efforts to leave Russia. Oops, come back there. There you go. In late summer of 1917, the commander of the ACM, Major Semet, had been recalled to Belgium, leaving Commander Paul Rose in charge. Traveling by special train, Commander Rose met with the nominal head of the Red Army, Ensign Nikolai Krylenko. After lengthy negotiations, Ensign Krylenko on the 16th of February gave Commander Rose permission to take the ACM out of Russia. The senior Red officer in Kiev, Lieutenant Colonel Muryavyov, should have complied with Ensign Krylenko's orders. Instead, he refused to provide the ACM with the necessary rail transport unless they handed over their arms, for which he was willing to offer compensation. Ultimately, he was convinced to relent, but 2 days later, the People's Commissar of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic in charge of military affairs, Kotyubinsky, refused to honor Lieutenant Colonel Muryavyov's orders and informed Commander Rose of his intention to confiscate the ACM's weapons. Commander Rose had no intention of leaving his men defenseless. He saw to it that 3 disassembled 37mm guns, several machine guns, and the unit's small arms were all hidden among the men's belongings. The armored cars were destroyed to deny their use to the communists, and the remaining vehicles, ration trucks, and motorcycles were used to convince Kotyubinsky to allow the Belgians to leave. On the 20th of February, the personnel of the ACM finally boarded a train for Moscow. Commander Rose and his men arrived in Moscow 5 days later with the intention of continuing on to Petrograd and from there to Murmansk. Their train rested beside another that happened to contain the Chinese embassy, which was being deported. Having just come from Petrograd, they informed Commander Rose of the conditions in the capital. This led Commander Rose to make a momentous decision. Instead of leaving by Murmansk, the ACM would make its way along the Trans-Siberian Railway to Vladivostok. The journey began on the 4th of March. At nearly every stop, the Belgians were bombarded with questions. Who are you? What uniforms are you wearing? Why are your soldiers dressed better than ours? What is your destination? And so forth. And on more than one occasion, the local authorities demanded the surrender of their remaining arms in exchange for permission to continue onwards, though the Belgians always managed to retain enough for their protection. At Omsk, Commander Rose was forced to sign an agreement promising that the men of the ACM would never take up arms against the Soviet Union. On the 27th of March, they crossed the border into China. According to the testimony of veterans, quote, at the first Chinese station, they literally threw themselves into the restaurant, where after many months of hunger, they were able to consume hot chocolate with freshly baked buns. In ecstasy, they admired in the windows of the local shop's pastry with cream and other long not seen delicacies and English cigarettes, unquote. I like the picture on the lower right there. It shows that the Belgians were very friendly people. They're here. Here it shows them making friends with some geisha in Harbin, China. How nice. I'm sure it was purely platonic. The unit lost 4 of its members in Harbin, not to combat, but to the attraction of serving under the White Russian leader, the Siberian Cossack Atman Gregory Semyonov. And those are the 4 there in that picture. When the ACM finally arrived in Vladivostok after their 64-day odyssey, they found the city in the hands of the Bolsheviks. Nevertheless, they received an enthusiastic welcome from the crews of the British, Japanese, and U.S. ships that were docked in port. Commander Rose managed to arrange for the transportation of his unit with the U.S. authorities, despite their suspicion that some of the Belgians harbored Bolshevik sympathies. At least in the case of the trade union activist Julien Lahat, their suspicions were justified, as he later became the leader of the Communist Party in Belgium. Sometime in late April or May, the ACM began their 18-day voyage to San Francisco on the U.S. military transport SS Sheridan. The Belgians' experience traveling through the United States was in stark contrast to their grueling trek across Siberia. Enthusiasm for the war was at its heights, so that the unexpected arrival of a veteran Allied unit presented various communities with the opportunity to show their support for the country's gallant allies in the struggle against the Hun. In both San Francisco and the state capital of Sacramento, the ACM participated in parades and was feted afterwards. On the 22nd of May, the Belgians were treated to a Wild West rodeo in Wyoming, and 3 days later they marched in yet another parade in Chicago. The Belgians recorded a less than flattering impression of Chicago, complaining of its pollution and large German-American community. They found Detroit much more to their liking, receiving a festive welcome from the Flemish community on the 26th of May. Following a visit to Niagara Falls, the ACM appeared in New York City's Memorial Day Parade. Departing from New York on a French military transport on the 15th of June, the Belgians arrived in Bordeaux between the 23rd and 24th of June. From there, they traveled north to Paris, and shortly afterwards, the ACM was officially disbanded on the 15th of July. Presumably, the officers and men were reassigned and participated in the Allied advance on the Western Front during the final months of the war. Altogether, 16 members of the ACM were killed. 14 died in Galicia, 11 of whom were buried in the cemetery in Ternopil. The remains of at least one of these men, René Rousselt, who had been killed in the action near Koniki on the 2nd of July, 1917, were repatriated to Brussels in 1921. Remarkably, a photo album that was started by Rousselt and finished by his comrades, containing 30 photographs along with newspaper clippings, was discovered in a flea market in Antwerp in March of 2000. The bravery shown by the men of the ACM is reflected in the fact that they were mentioned 5 times in the Russian orders of the day. In February 1919, the Brotherhood of the ACM was founded, dedicated to fostering the remembrance of the unit. Presumably, the efforts of the organization contributed in part to the veterans receiving the commemorative war medal in 1931 with a bar reading 1916 R, the letter R, 1917, to denote their service in Russia. On the 18th of February 1939, a memorial plaque was unveiled at Pins Bourdoin Barracks in Brussels, honoring the memory of the ACM. The last surviving member of the ACM died in 1992, but their memory lives on in print, in museum displays, and even potential film projects. There's some of the publications about the ACM. And if anybody wants a copy of this, of the paper that I just read here, just contact me via my email and I will send you a copy of the paper. Thank you.
Well, Paul, may I say something? I don't know whether anybody can hear me, but you've done an incredible amount of research here. You have wonderful slides. Their detail of the fighting is amazing of what you've done. And your general delivery and explanation of the battlefield fighting was impressive beyond words. Now, I can see that you spent many an hour on this, and we never hear much about the Belgian army, as I said in the beginning, but you certainly played their part. I have one question for you. Do we know the exact number of Belgians that went to the Eastern Front that you know?
The 300 I think it was 333 by one count departed Brest on the SS Ray Castle. So presumably that's the number of men that actually served with the ACM, um, at least when it actually arrived in Archangel. Of course, sickness and accident, not just combat, would have reduced those numbers over time. But note that 100 new recruits were sent to join the unit while it was at the front in Russia for the fighting in 1917. So I imagine the numbers fluctuated accordingly.
Well, the other question is that how many of these survived to see Belgium victimized in World War II? Do you
That's
know?
a good question. I don't know really. I mean, I would imagine most of them, assuming, I don't know. Unfortunately, once the ACM was dissolved, um, I don't have any information beyond that in terms of the military careers of the members of the ACM. So I'm, as I said, presumably they were reassigned to other units in the Belgian army and took part in the 100 Days Offensive at the end of the war, which the Belgian army participated in. So presumably some of them were wounded and killed during that fighting, but unfortunately, I have no idea how many that might have been.
Okay. All right, it's open for questions, please. Anybody have questions for Paul? Go forth.
Paul, this is Randy Galkey. Just had a question about the difficulty of operating those vehicles and when your supply lines are thousands of miles away. Can you
Mm-hmm.
comment on that at all?
Yeah, well, that's for one thing, that's why the support for the unit was substantially increased when they were going to be sent to Russia rather than when they were serving in the West. And I imagine that must have included truckloads of spare parts. They did lose armored cars. That, as you noted, one was lost at the fighting in Koniki, but I'm sure others may have simply broken down and been unable to be fixed. You'll notice that the second engagement in Koniki involved one of the Belgian crew operating a Russian armored car supplied to them, as a substitute. And if you, if I go back here, I'll go back with my slides here, and you can see there at the barracks in Kiev after they after they withdrew from the front when the Bolsheviks had taken over. You can see in the barracks in Kiev that there are still some Peugeots and Moors, but both of these here on the first two from going from left to right are both Russian armored cars. So yeah, it would have been very difficult, and of course the automobile was still a fairly new technology at this time. So, it would have been very difficult, but it appears they did manage to keep most of their vehicles in operation.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, thank you for the most wonderful pictures you've got. It's
Oh,
amazing what detail you've given us. I can't believe how many of these you got. I mean, this is incredible
well,
that you.
I think it's partly because of Rene Rousselt and his comrades putting together that album, because many of these pictures are from that album.
Uh-huh.
If I had tried to do this before the year 2000, when the album resurfaced, we wouldn't have nearly as many illustrations.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. All right. Does anybody else have questions for him? Please. Uh, and please put my email on there again. So if anybody wants to make a delivery or any topic, let's hear it. Okay. My email address is scampagno2 @gmail.com. Now, anybody have any other questions? Because I think Paul's worn out. Any more questions, please? Well, thank you very much. And everybody was,
Question,
all right, question there.
Mr. I just found, John Gutman out in the other side of the country,
Mhm.
earlier you mentioned that the Russians had a problem with a Jew in the ranks of the Belgian armored car force.
Yeah.
What was their problem with him? The fact that he was an officer, or just the fact that he was there at all?
Just the fact I think just the fact that he was there at all, needless to say, Russia was, deeply anti-Semitic. That was, that I think that was the problem. Now, of course, whether that's the reason that Major Cologne was replaced by Major Semet, it's hard to say. I mean, this is what the Russians told him when he asked about why he was being replaced. And of course, you could make the argument that the Belgian military attaché in Petrograd, he, as you know, Semet was his staff officer. So you can make the argument that he was just looking for an excuse to replace Colin with his somebody who he wanted to, advance through the ranks. Of course, that's mere speculation on my part, but it seems more than coincidental that this would be the person picked to replace him. As far as anti-Semitism went, it gives me no pleasure to relate the fact that the Belgians themselves were anti-Semitic. I'm sorry to say that was the case, but it was. And so, this was tragically, this was all too common throughout Europe, whether it was Belgium, whether it was Russia, whether it was Germany or France or any place else. After all, this isn't very, not too long after the court martial of I'm trying to think of his name.
Dreyfus?
But yeah, Dreyfus, exactly right. Yeah. So it's an ugly part of the history, obviously.
Well, heck, Willie Coppens admitted to me that he was, and he and I were friends.
Uh-huh.
But so what did they do with this guy? Deport him, or give him a chance to fight?
I don't know. Oh, do you mean the commander of the ACM, Colin,
No,
who was replaced?
this odd man out.
Oh,
This
you mean
Jewish
the
fellow in the ranks.
Jewish fellow who was among some of the liaison people? I think I imagine he was probably an enlisted man. I imagine they probably just transferred him someplace else. But you know how it is in the armed forces. If you want to get rid of somebody, you can always transfer him someplace.
Yeah, Paul,
Either that or you could promote him, one or the other.
Paul, one more
Thank
issue.
you.
I'm sorry I bring this up.
Sure.
But did this ACM, were they comprised mostly of Flemish or Walloon troops?
That's a really good question. And I never came across anything to say one or the other. I think we talked about this on the phone. The only reference to those divisions was the Flemish community in Detroit. And I don't think it's a reflection of that particular ethnicity. I think that anybody from Belgium, they would have come out and celebrated them because, hey, how many times does a Belgian army unit arrive in Detroit?
That's
So I don't think it was, oh, you guys are Flemish, so are we. No, I don't think that was necessarily the case. I really don't know. And that, by the way, that would be a very interesting topic for a graduate student in Belgium to see how the Belgian army handled that, if they handled it at all, or what the implications were for that for the Belgian army's recruitment.
Yeah, that's true.
Mm-hmm.
And in the times I've been in Belgium, it's still an issue that between the Flemish and the Walloon.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm in the Flemish area, I have to be very hesitant using any French in that area. So it's just one of those experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Paul, I want to thank you for the most brilliant job your wonderful slides and everything about it. You're very impressive. And yes, you will be able to give another talk at another
Thank you.
Again, everybody, I need speakers. Give me some names, please. And Shelley, would you put my email again online so that everybody can see it, please?
Okay, well, I guess I'll go. So thank you for having me. I really enjoyed
you.
this. And once again, if anybody wants a copy of what the presentation, just contact me by my email and I'll send you an attached copy. Okay. Thanks again. Take care now.
All right. Thank you for everyone. Bye-bye.